I'm here in Yerushalayim, overlooking the old city and the surrounding. One of the most amazing sights on planet Earth for Klal Yisrael nowadays. I'm on the top floor of the Churva Shul, which has been rebuilt. It's been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt many times. It's a Beit Knesset of Yehuda HaChassid. It was 300 years ago, an aliyah of Yehuda HaChassid, Genaz aliyot of that period, and he introduced a whole community here into the old city of Jerusalem. And I'd just like to say a few words about Parshas Pinchas, and I thought this might be an opportune moment to do so. It contains two words in Parshas Pinchas, which I think are of particular interest, have an immense depth to them, and are relevant to the world we live in today. Pinchas himself, Chazal tell us, went on to become the Kohen Mashuach Milchama, which means he was responsible for speaking to the soldiers before they went out into battle, to inspire them, to focus their minds and their hearts on what they're fighting for, on their ideology, on their emunah, in the idea of Kedusha, of Klal Yisrael. And this was because the Pinchas had this tremendous power of purity of motive, a type of an Eish Kodesh that was in his soul, which allowed him to engage in what seems to be an act of violence, but actually the Torah tells us that this, what seemed to be an act of violence, was actually a necessary event in order to create Shalom in Klal Yisrael. Shalom in so many different ways, primarily the Shalom between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people. So I'd just like to have a look at these two words. The third pasuk of the Parsha reads as follows: L'chein emor hineni nosein loy es brisi shalom. The Brit Shalom, a covenant of peace, something which we are so urgently in need of in every generation, and maybe in our generation more than most, to have Shalom to be able to live b'Shalom. But what is really here, there's some very beautiful and interesting depths to this Bris Shalom, which is connected to Pinchas and in his in this week's parsha. So have a look at a few Perushim here. I'll give you three different Perushim to how to look at it through the eyes of Chazal. The first is Poshe Pshat, which you find in the Ibn Ezra and Rabbeinu Bachaye, that Brisi Shalom means HaKadosh Baruch Hu often promises him Shalom, meaning protection from his enemies, meaning those people who are the relatives of Zimri and Cosby, the two people who he executed, that they would want to avenge their death. They were the closest relatives, and they were both, Zimri was a prince and Cosby was a princess, and they were important people and they would clearly have a following and a family who wouldn't take lightly the fact that they'd been executed, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises him protection from his enemies. So that's the first Bris Shalom that we're desperately in need of, is protection from those people who wish to destroy us. And we are surrounded, unfortunately, in these years, in these past months, by a barbaric enemy, as Netanyahu said in Congress yesterday. He said, some people say this is a clash of civilizations, the battle that we're fighting against Hamas, but he says that's not quite right. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization. It's a clash between people who glorify death against the people who sanctify life. And I thought that was never had a truer word been said about the current conflict. But what we desperately need is the Bris Shalom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to help us find a way to resolve peacefully the terrible circumstances that we are seeing at the moment. So the first Perush of Bris Shalom is simply protection from our enemies, which Yehirotzen, all our soldiers should be protected every moment of the day from all those who are trying to attack us. The second Perush is found in the Sforno, where he says Bris Shalom is actually a covenant of peace, meaning Shalom, protection, says the Sforno, from death itself, from the Malach HaMoves. Pinchas remarkably lived an enormously a lengthy life, many centuries. We find him mentioned many centuries later at the end of the book of Shoftim, and he was given a special gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, living longer than any other person in all the generations that he lived. And this was a special, reward for him, in the sense that his actions saved Klal Yisrael from a spiritual and moral disaster. And that's the Bris Shalom according to the Sforim. The third parish that I'd like to share with you is possibly even more relevant to the world we live in today, is found in the writings of the Netziv, in the Hamek Dava. So he speaks about the fact of human nature that when one engages in acts of violence and brutality in war, however justified the war is and however correct the act of violence might be, it has a negative influence on a person's psyche, on a person's neshama and on his temperament, and after doing it many times, the person becomes brutalized. You become a killing machine. And it's well known in armies, after soldiers come back from a tour of fighting, that they need to be rehabilitated in order to be able to live a normal life with their wife and children and with society, and to stop becoming killing machines. Says the Hamek Dava, Hinei Nosles Brisi Shalom, I give him a promise to all future generations of soldiers that if they fight their battles l'shem shamayim, I will protect them, that they won't become hardened and in any way by the acts that they need to perform. And I must tell you, it's a very interesting fact. I've met in the last week many soldiers who have been in active service in Gaza and have been surrounded by terrible violence and death and difficulties. One soldier, when I asked him, where have you been in Gaza? He says, I've been in a world of choshech v'tzalmoves, the darkness of death, surrounded by violence and fighting and explosions. And this for him was certainly a moment of where potentially being surrounded by these events could have a negative impact on him, on his personality. The promise to Pinchas was Brisi Shalom, that Klal Yisrael will be protected from these effects. There is actually a similar pasuk in Sefer Devarim which speaks about the Ir Hanidachas, where the pasuk there says that under certain extreme circumstances, which actually never happened, a whole city would need to be destroyed, which would be a massive act of violence. And the pasuk says, "V'nosan lecha rachamim v'richamecha," on which the Tziv says the same idea. That you would have thought that if you have to do this, you will become a brutalized, violent person. There's a special bracha to preserve your sensitivity. And I remember I saw just recently, I met somebody who was a commander in a tank division who'd been engaged in very, very difficult, violent activities for months in Gaza. And I met him at a family simcha, and he was playing with his children. He got up to say Dvar Torah, and he hadn't lost his adinus hanefesh, neither in his bein adam lechaveiro, nor in his understanding of Torah and mitzvahs and ruchnius. And I thought that was really part of the Brisi Shalom that the Netziv is describing. Having said that, there is another feature of the word Brisi Shalom as it appears in the parsha. If you're a kohen and you get called up to the Sefer Torah, have a close look at the word Shalom and you will see something very, very strange. And that is that the letter Vov in Brisi Shalom is broken. It's a broken letter. And a broken letter usually, in fact, in every other case of every other letter in the Sefer Torah, makes the word possible. In fact, makes whole Sefer Torah possible until it's amended by a Sefer. And yet here you have what's called a Vov Ketiyah, a Vov which is broken in the middle of the word Shalom. Why is that so? So this is also a very profound, subtle point. And of course it's true that Pinchas had achieved a Shalom of sorts by getting rid of this terrible potential deterioration of Klal Yisrael with the Benos Midian, where Cosby and Zimri had publicly flaunted the Aveira of intermarriage. But at the same time, Shalom, which is achieved through the use of violence, is not the Shalom that we hope for. It's not the ultimate Shalom that we daven for. Oseh Shalom b'mreimov, Uyaseh Shalom aleinu. The ultimate Shalom is a Shalom without the romach, is without the spear, without the tanks, and without the murder and the violence. And therefore this Shalom actually, in some way, on the one hand, it's a bracha to us, and it's a covenant. Pinchas continues throughout the generations to inspire generation after generation of soldiers to fight for Am Yisrael and for Eretz Yisrael with a proper kavanah and proper motivation, but at the same time, it's a vov katia. It's imperfect, and it's a flawed shalom, and our tefillah is to be able to see the ultimate shalom, which will not involve any of this terrible violence. And Bez Hashem, area that we see before us should Bez Hashem only be a place of bracha, v'shalom, and that we should be'etzem be able to live here, in the palace of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yerushalayim HaKodesh for many generations to come, and see Lachazos B'noyam Hashem Olavake B'hei Choloi Amen.